You do not need to stick to old school rules when it comes to creating your next vision board. It's a place where you can have a future focused vision, one where clarity meets creativity. Grab your cup of tea and let's dive into it. So, don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the nostalgia of an old school vision board where you would sit down with your magazines and you would cut out pictures that resonated with you and stick them on your vision board. But I just feel like in our modern world, the old school cut and paste of vision boards and collaging in that way just does not work anymore. And that is because it relies on magazines that you probably aren't even purchasing much of anymore. And that really limits what you are going to put on your vision board. Hence, it limits the vision that you are creating for that future focused self that you really want to elevate in your vision board. As an alternative to that, you might collect images online and then make an effort to actually print them out. But the problem is a lot of people create their vision boards in the festive season. I know that's what I love to do, ready for a new year. But when you have so much on during that period, it becomes really hard to add even just one more thing to that list, and having to go to the printers to actually get this done, unless you have a printer at home, which is super convenient, but I know that a lot of people don't anymore. But having to make a trip to the printers amongst everything else that you have to do during the holiday season is just one more thing to think about. And I personally feel like when it comes to anything related to self-development, if you can remove all of the little elements of friction as much as possible, then you're more likely going to do that thing and you're going to get the best result. And when it comes to the old school physical vision boards, as much as they can be a really nice idea, I do also feel like a good vision board can take up a lot of space, and depending on your living situation, it can also be on full display to the people around you, which you may not necessarily want. You might be hyper focused on your vision, but not necessarily want everyone else to be privy to what that vision is. And in addition to that as well, it's not easy to edit your vision board once you have created it in the physical way. It becomes a lot harder to make changes. So today I want to talk about the way that I have reimagined my own personal vision boarding process over the last few years and what I find works for me instead of the old school method of a physical, pretty big vision board. So let's talk about the way that I break down my vision board process. So first off, I find that when you sit down with your physical magazines, a lot of the time you're just drawn to the images that you find most aesthetically appealing to you, instead of having a real strategy behind what it is that you're putting on your vision board. So what I like to begin with is this idea of stop clipping and start strategizing. So what is the strategy of your vision board? What's the strategy of that future focused vision that you have for yourself? And you can put a little bit of structure around this if you want to make this a little bit easier for you to hone your direction for your future self. And I find one of the ways that I really like to do that is to follow some concepts that I learned in Michael Hyatt's book, Your Best Year Ever. This was a book that really resonated with me, and I love to actually read this time of the year. So whether it is the end of a year or the very beginning of a new year, usually I find it a really good read in December. And one of the reasons that I love to revisit this book is because he talks about this concept of your domains of life. And there are about 10 different domains that he lists out in the book. And those are spiritual, intellectual, emotional, physical, marital, parental, social, vocational, avocational, and financial. And what he highlights is that you don't need to have necessarily priorities in all of those areas, but the key is understanding which domains you want to focus on in your year ahead. So you might pick, for example, a range of those domains. You might pick the ones that are most important to you. I know I usually find that I like to focus on about 7 of them at least, but you might also find that you can find priorities in all 10 of them as as well. But the point is, you don't have to actually feel pressure to tick every one of those boxes. Maybe marital doesn't actually apply to you. Maybe parental doesn't actually apply to you, for example, as well. But I really like to start in this place when it comes to setting my priorities for the next year ahead. For example, when it came to spiritual, some of the priorities that I have set in previous years have related to, one year I wanted to read the Bible, so I did that as a part of spiritual. I think in the last year I had in spiritual my commitment to morning pages, which is something that I have talked about on this channel as well, and a habit that I absolutely have loved adding to my routine. And I just did another episode on that as well if you're interested in that topic. And in terms of intellectual, for example, this might be, if you follow this channel, you would know that I absolutely love reading. And what I like to often do is set themes related to my reading. So I've read over 100 books a year for several years now. And this year, for example, I read 3 books a week. And what I normally do in that intellectual domain is that I like to set a little bit of a theme. So in previous years, I've been a little bit stricter with some of the themes that I've come up with. They have related to, for example, wanting to learn more about real estate or finance or anything sort of in more of that business sphere. And in more recent years, intellectual was, for example, reading classic books for an entire year, so fiction classic books, which is not something that I would normally read, so that was different for me. And in this year, that was related to a lot of themes of different things that I wanted to explore. I was much more broader with my reading this year. You might have physical goals, for example, that might be, previous years I've done things like my 10,000 steps a day, and you can just go down that list and see what actually works best for you and set some priorities in that space in the different domains. And then I feel like that is a really good starting place to actually know what you're putting on your vision board to begin with. But the key is to not just set visual goals, but to actually make packs. This is something that really resonated with me when I read the book Tiny Experiments recently. And the idea behind this book is to reimagine the way that you see goal setting. And as someone who is really obsessive about goal setting, or I have been for at least over a decade now, I have been setting really intentional goals at the end of the year and the start of a new year. This was something that really caught my attention as to this idea of goal setting being broken. And I've really tried to reimagine the way that I goal set. I know I've talked a lot about the 10x rule, which I absolutely love, and the 12-week year. But this was a whole other concept because it was talking about why goals to begin with is broken. And it talks about the fact that goals can be focused on outcomes, whereas pacts, which are commitments that you make with yourself, they are focused on the process. So you go from being outcome orientated to process orientated. And while it has some elements of a traditional goal setting formula, for example, it talks about the importance of your pacts being time bound, like you might see in a SMART formula, it's still very different to a SMART goal setting process, because a SMART goal setting process, for example, might have a goal that is time bound in terms of, by December 31st, I will have XYZ. Whereas the tiny experiments and the packs approach is about having goals, or about having packs that are time bound in the sense that it is an end to that experiment. And you can have your experiments be as simple and as quick and easy as you want it to be, or they can be more intense. Like the author of this book, who wrote, I believe it was 100 articles in 100 days, or you might set yourself a goal to do something over 10 days. You're just doing one activity over 10 days. Or it might be something like going to the gym 3 times a week for the month of January. You are setting a pact with yourself, and then you're taking that data that you get from that experiment and you are evolving. So it talks a lot about this idea of growth loops as opposed to fixed ladders. And that that being the way that you can progress. But when it comes to vision boarding, my point is to think about the process behind the vision that you have for yourself. So if, for example, you create content and you have a goal to get to X amount of subscribers by the end of the year, then when it comes to your vision board, that potentially isn't all that useful because that focuses on an outcome that you might not necessarily be able to control. You can't control it, but you can control the input that you put into that. You can control the process. So with your vision board then, a more useful picture might be something that is related to the process. So it might be, for example, seeing that you have 50 plus videos uploaded and you might need to clip that from someone else's profile and try and be as specific as possible with that. But the point is, what is the process? So to give you an example in a different domain, if you, for example, have a financial goal to invest in the stock market, then you might have on your vision board, instead of what the value of your portfolio is, you might have, for example, the process of you uploading a certain amount of money every fortnight or every month. So you might do that in your bank account or look like you are doing that in your bank account. Take a screenshot of that process and put that onto your vision board. So it becomes about the process as opposed to the outcome. But despite how much I love the idea of tiny experiments and making packs and totally rethinking the way that you goal set, I would still, as another point, highlight that you want to be hyper specific. So, for example, as I've talked about on this channel, neurolinguistics programming promotes that the mind can't differentiate between what is vividly imagined and what is real. So detailed visualizations of desired outcomes become this form of mental rehearsal. So as much as I do like the idea of including process elements in your vision board, I do also still resonate with the idea of tricking your brain into what you actually see that vision being. That's the whole idea of a vision board, is to think big, to not always have to be so realistic with what you're putting on your vision board. But I would say that when you are putting those really big visions onto your vision board, still try and be really specific. So if, for example, you have the goal of wanting to travel a lot more this year, then don't just clip generic photos of travel. Clip very specific images. What are the countries? What are the cities? Where do you see yourself staying? What's the view that you imagine you would have from your accommodation? Be as specific as you can be, so you're telling your brain what it is that you want it to focus on. If you see yourself making a particular income goal, for example, then have images of that amount of money in your bank account. Be really specific. Try and find images that relate to that. Something that I like to do is also take screenshots of things as they happen. So if, for example, you have something happen to you that you go, actually, that is really cool, I'd love to see more of that, and you can somehow take an image of that. Say it is a particular great payday that you had. You might take a screenshot of that and save that for your vision board because you want more of that level of income. That is where you can be a lot more specific about the process while also aligning to the big picture vision. My next point is to embrace temporal landmarks. Now, this is an idea that really caught my attention when I read the book When by Dianne. And he talks about this concept of, as humans, we learn to navigate space through the use of landmarks, so physical landmarks. But what we can often forget about is that we actually navigate our lives through time as well. And that is why things like New Year's and the start of a new month or the start of a new season or a new season of your life in general are really important when it comes to our growth, because it gives us that temporal landmark. It gives us something something to be able to focus on. And when it comes to our vision board, a lot of people, as I mentioned, love to do this at the start of a year or at the end of a year because it just aligns perfectly to how we are feeling during that period. But you might also find that starting your vision board or creating your vision board works at a different time of the year for you. For example, you might find that aligning to your birthday, whenever that might be a great time to start your vision board. For me personally, my birthday is in November, so it aligns really closely with when I would normally be wanting to start my vision board anyway. And last year, I started my vision board on my birthday. I started to put together the draft of my vision board as a new little addition to my birthday routine. And to be honest, I never actually had a birthday routine up until I did that, and I really loved doing that. And it's something that I continued this year as well, and I plan to do that going forward as well. I personally have never really been one to absolutely love my birthdays. I've always felt a little bit strange about them, but the second that I introduced this to my routine, it honestly changed my entire outlook on birthday because it really became much more focused about the vision that I had for the year ahead and how exciting that was. And I kid you not, last year, so the first year that I did this, by the time I came back from my birthday dinner, there were already things that had massively manifested from what I had put on my vision board. And I'm not saying this is something that will happen to everyone or that it's happened every year, but it was really nice to see that manifest in that way. But it also doesn't need to be about your birthday. The point is to try and think about this as a temporal landmark. So, for example, there might be another particular day of significance that you find is a really good time to start to think about your vision board or start to work on that draft. I personally have also found that spending at least a little bit of time or finalizing my vision board on New Year's Eve feels really nice to do as well. So, before you're heading out to whatever you're doing, or even if that is what you do as a part of your New Year's celebration, I've really found just making a little bit of time, whether it is half an hour or an hour, just to be able to sit down with your vision board ahead of ticking over into the new year is just also a really nice addition to that end of year reset. So I want to also reiterate the point about digitizing your vision board. As you've probably gathered from everything that I've talked about, that is the method that I like to use for my vision board. I like to take a digital first approach to my vision board, and I create my vision board on Canva. And then what I do is I download it from Canva and I set it as my desktop background on my laptop. And what I love about this is that it means that you see your vision board every day, consciously or subconsciously, as a part of your everyday routine really effortlessly. So you don't actually have to really force yourself to add these new additions to your routine. So I know people talk about, having to spend a couple of minutes staring at your vision board as a part of your routine. And I know that that can sound super easy, but if you're someone who already has a jam-packed routine, morning routine or a night routine, just even those little additions can be difficult to actually follow through with. So what I have found with using this approach of having my vision board be on my desktop means that I am seeing that vision board the entire year, whether I try to or not, which has made it a really, really nice process. And what I also like about the digital vision board as opposed to the physical vision board is that it gives you a little bit of grace to be able to change your mind. So I've actually found that I've made a couple of additions over the last couple years to my vision board, because what I find is that you can feel a different way at the end of the year and at the start of the year. You're hyper motivated in particular areas. And as the year progresses, sometimes it's not that you have lost your motivation in particular areas. Sometimes it's that your goals and your priorities have changed as you have evolved. If you think about the person that you were at the start of this year, for example, I'm going to guess that you feel like a different version of yourself at the end of the year. You've at least evolved in some way. And that is where I feel like if you have that grace with yourself during the year, then you don't have to stick to the rigid vision board that you have created for yourself. Because if your priorities have shifted, then you want to reflect that in real time on your vision board. And that is where, if I get an inkling that sticks with me long enough that there is something that I want to change, that something has shifted, then I will change that. I'll re-edit my vision board and I will download the new one and put that onto my desktop. So I think it is a nice way to just allow yourself that flexibility when it comes to the vision that you had for yourself as well, rather than having to wait a whole entire year to then update that again. And my final point, if you follow this channel, should come as no surprise, and that is to break down your vision board using Pinterest. So there is only so much space that you have on your vision board, whether you are doing a digital vision board or you are creating a physical vision board. There's only so much that you can put on there. And usually, as a part of that process, you want to cover off a lot of different categories. So you might have, for example, the image of you doing yoga on your vision board. But what I find using Pinterest really does is that it allows you to break that vision down even further. So instead of just having one image of you practicing yoga, you might have, for example, lots of images, which is what I do, of the poses that you want to learn as a part of yoga. You're bringing that vision to life in more of a living vision board in a way. It's more of a working vision board. You can constantly add to it. You can take things away. You can really dive into those goals in more detail. So to give you another example, you might have, for example, some sort of aesthetic relating to healthy eating on your vision board. Whereas on your Pinterest board related to food, you can break that down much further. You can have a lot of the foods that you would love to have as a part of your nutrition going into the new year. So it just gives you a place to really create subboards related to each of those visions that you have on your vision board as well. And that is probably one of my favorite parts of the vision board process, is to not just have to take this set and forget approach with the vision board that you create for a year, but actually bringing that to life using Pinterest. So if you want to learn more about the process that I use for reimagining my year ahead using Pinterest, then check out my previous episode on this topic. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.